I've been fortunate to witness the progress of oncology, thinking about diseases such as lung cancer, for example, where very few effective treatments were available in the 90s. And now you see the breadth and depth of options that patients with non-small cell lung cancer has dramatically changed their outcome.
There's a moment in every oncology lab where everything stops. A scientist looks at a single unexpected curve and realizes months of work and millions in hope have been overturned by one simple truth: that cancer doesn't follow the rules.
There were hypotheses by which one could think that at some point we could help or teach or modify the way our white blood cells can fight against cancer. Unfortunately, cancer cells are quite smart, or they adapt quickly.
The future of cancer really begins, not in the breakthroughs we celebrate, but in the questions we ask when things don't work. A world where biology, data, intuition, and emotion all collide together. My guest today, Dr. Diaz-Padilla, is a clinician, scientist, and global oncology leader at Diaries. Someone who has walked the full journey of a cancer therapy, from bedside to the lab bench and to the boardroom.
Acceptance of losing patients because it's life, and you need to definitely protect yourself or prepare yourself psychologically.
How do you stay grounded in a field where the stakes are so huge?
This is part of the game. Back to my sportsmanship analogy, Federer, this legend of tennis, said that he may have lost more points than he may have won, and still is one of the greatest. Or Michael Jordan in basketball, he said that he failed many baskets, but he's regarded as one of the greatest, if not the greatest. So taking this back to a professional ground, if you are persistent and resilient about the failures, take those learnings seriously, and you are equipped with people, other skills to learn about those, the next mission will be a bit more successful.
Have you heard of any such instances where after a rigorous clinical trial, somehow it didn't go in the direction we were hoping and the patients were totally dissatisfied?
In my experience, cancer patients are the best human beings as patients. The gratitude that someone suffering with cancer has towards us, the physicians and the nurses and the people in hospital, it is something sort of extraordinary.
Ivan, welcome to Drug Diaries. Before we jump into today's episode, I just want to say something from the heart. Over 93% of the people who watch this podcast regularly haven't subscribed. And listen, I get it. Life is busy. You click, you watch, you move on. But if you've ever felt like this show brings you value, if it has made you think, sparked a new idea, introduced you to something inspiring, then I have a small favor to ask. Please hit that subscribe button. It might not seem like much, but to me, it means everything. This podcast has always been a labor of love. No sponsors, no script, just honest conversations with people trying to make a difference in the world of healthcare. And your support, your one click, helps me keep doing that. It helps more people discover these voices. It helps this community grow. So if you're here, if you believe in this, please consider subscribing. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the episode. There's a moment in every oncology lab where everything stops. A scientist looks at a single unexpected curve and realizes months of work and millions in hope have been overturned by one simple truth: that cancer doesn't follow the rules. But every so often, something remarkable happens. A pattern no one saw. A patient who responds against all odds. A discovery hidden inside what looked like a failure. And that's where the future of cancer really begins. Not in the breakthroughs we celebrate, but in the questions we ask when things don't work. Today we are stepping into that world. A world where biology, data, intuition, and emotion all collide together. Where immuno-oncology is both our greatest achievement and our most perplexing mystery. Where failed pathways may hold the key to the next generation of cancer treatments. Because here's the truth. For every therapy that succeeds, most never reach a patient. Yet inside those failures lies the blueprint for saving lives. And my guest today is one of the few people who knows how to read that blueprint. Dr. Diaz-Padilla is a clinician, scientist, and global oncology leader at Ipsen. Someone who has walked the full journey of a cancer therapy, from bedside to the lab bench and to the boardroom. He understands cancer not just as a disease, but as a puzzle built from biology, behavior, regulation, hope, and persistence. Today, he's here to help us understand where cancer research is truly heading and what it will take to build a future where cancer becomes a predictable, manageable disease. Future. So if you've ever wondered
why most therapies fail, how a few change everything, and what the next era of oncology might actually look like. Listen closely, because what Dr. Padilla shares today may change the way you think about science, medicine, and the future of human life. Ivan, welcome to Drug Diaries.
Thank you very much, Kaushik. I'm very pleased to be here, and hopefully my insights and thoughts are helpful for others.
I'm 100% sure it's going to be one of the most enlightening discussions. To begin with, Ivan, may I request you to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah. Well, as you said, Kaushik, well, you put very nice words into the descriptor. I would describe myself as a passionate physician who loves and loved their patients in an attempt to help them overcome or live longer and better with a terrible disease, which is cancer. When I started treating patients, still oncology was that specialty within medicine that very few people wanted to choose because it had, and it still has, very negative connotations. The chances for help others were probably minimal and not very efficacious. And I felt that was worth the try, not only because of the science, but because of the mission behind. And after a certain amount of years, I had the opportunity to translate, if you wish, those bedside learnings, to your point, to develop drugs or help develop drugs that may have a global impact to those patients that I served or that I looked after when I was in the hospital or in the clinic.
Right. Well, thank you for that introduction and very impressive career trajectory from being a clinician to an R&D scientist. And Ivan, before all the titles and responsibility, what set you on this path?
The willingness to help others, I would say, and of course, throughout our lives, we've got inspirations. And I cannot deny the influence of close family members, people who dreamed to become doctors, which is the very first obligation. Before becoming an oncologist, you need to have a foundation of medicine.
Yes.
But to me, what is behind medicine is that power, if you wish, also there is a sense of potential to help others in health issues that matters for all of us in our daily lives.
Right.
That was probably the beginning of everything. And there are always people in our ways that cross our paths and inspire us and inspired me. My father did, definitely. And then throughout the journey, probably none of us, or very few of us, I think actually none of us could claim that we have achieved X, Y, or Z without the help of others. People who opened doors or who gave us good advice or who have been beside us on through tough moments in our personal lives or professional lives. And then that consequence of events or people around us is what ultimately led us to be where we are or where I am. And I don't forget any minute about those people or those circumstances. I wouldn't be speaking to you today because you would have never probably come across my profile had I not had those people around me.
Right. Ivan, in drug development, we talk about inflection points, the moment where the data flips or the trial opens a new direction. But people have inflection points too, a choice, a risk, a difficult pivot, one of those moments when you look back and realize life would have taken a completely different shape if you had chosen otherwise. So, Ivan, what was that turning point in your career that changed the trajectory of your life?
Perhaps more than one, I would say. As I was trying to describe before, the first one was the choice of studying medicine and hopefully succeeding in getting into medical school in my native Spain. The second one, a few years later, when that varies country by country and system by system, when I decided to pursue a career in oncology.
Right.
And I could have gone and choose something else. And I say clearly that that could have been the case because at the time, thankfully, I had opportunities to have done other subspecialties. And outside of work, I should share with you and with the audience that I'm a passionate sportsman.
Wow.
I love sports, and my dream outside of the professional world would have been to become an Olympic swimmer, for example. Not for example, it's the truth, or a professional sportsman. Related to that, I was thinking, oh gosh, what if I could do sports medicine and something like that? Since I couldn't become a professional sportsman, I could be close to the world that I was passionate about. But then I reflected back and said, well, that is more like a hobby or a passion, but I really want to go back to my roots and and trying to do something big. What could be bigger than trying to help and give hope to those who are hopeless? And at the time, in the early 90s, in the early 90s, mid-90s, oncology was, as I described before, that specialty that nobody really wanted to get themselves into. And I said, okay, let's do that. So that's a second inflection point. And the third one, perhaps more related to the professional success, if you wish, was one after around 15 years of clinical practice. We decided, and I say we because, as I said before, I wouldn't be here without the support of my wife, was to devote my career to drug development in the pharmaceutical industry. So those are the three inflection points.
Eventually, you found your ikigai, the sweet spot, and we're so
Perhaps.
glad. So, Ivan, when I speak to clinicians who transitioned into industry, there's always this internal battle they describe. The tension between caring for one patient in front of you and shifting into a world where a decision can impact thousands. It's a huge psychological jump, and one most people never fully understand. So, what was going on internally when you made that leap?
Stay grounded, because ultimately, even though you don't see the patient in front of you, once you move to the pharmaceutical industry, you need to see them somehow in data points. Data points, to me, are not an analyte value or a disease characteristic. I tried to think of those that I looked after before. So if you stay grounded on your role as a healthcare professional or physician or nurse, there are also many nurses in our industry, you would not lose that North Star, that what you're doing is not a direct influence into somebody else who's sitting in front of you in the office, in the hospital, but it may have, as you said, a global impact. So if that vocational interest in you to serve others is just the scope and the way, but the spirit and the how stays unchanged, which is helping a patient. The difference that you don't have that person in front of you anymore. But if you think about it, think about many patients worldwide or in a certain region or a certain country, depending on the scope of your role. But ultimately, keeping the patient always in your head has helped me hopefully do a better job.
And one of the things that fascinates me about oncology is that it demands both scientific precision and emotional resilience. You're dealing with the highest stakes: hope, survival, uncertainty, and the outcomes aren't always what you wish for. And leaders don't often talk about emotional cost of that, but it's real. How do you stay grounded in a field where the stakes are so human?
I think it goes back to the clinic, as I was saying before. I've been fortunate to witness the progress of oncology, like many other colleagues, thinking about diseases such as lung cancer, for example, where very few effective treatments were available in the 90s. And now you see the breadth and depth of options that patients with non-small cell lung cancer, which is a subtype of this disease, has dramatically changed their outcomes. Going back to your question, I think is the acceptance of failure, the acceptance of losing patients, because it's death is part of our life. It's the end of it. And you need to definitely protect yourself or prepare yourself psychologically to those failures. But at the same time, and I think we may talk about this later, the important thing about the failure is how you learn about it and what you want to do about it. The same, of course, in industry, at a different scale. Of course, you are more detached from the emotional direct contact with the patient and their families. But if a certain company or a certain department or ourselves are heavily invested financially and also in terms of effort into a given molecule that may or may not become a drug, and then when it comes to that late stage of the clinical trial, you see that the results were not what you expected. That is also a big failure, because if you think about it, it means that many people put their hopes, as we did, in the development of that drug to have a better outcome for that disease, a better symptom improvement, whatever, and it didn't work. So I think the way of being grounded again and say, okay, this is part of the game. Back to my sportsmanship analogy, Federer, this legend of tennis, said that he may have lost more points than he may have won, and still is one of the greatest or Michael Jordan in basketball. He said that he failed many baskets, but he's regarded as one of the greatest, if not the greatest. So taking this back to a professional ground, if you learned and are persistent and resilient about the failures, probably if you take those learnings seriously and you're equipped with people and other skills to learn about those, the next mission will be a bit more successful. And that's the way, as a whole, to keep yourself protected emotionally from outcomes that you wish they would have been different.
And something I hear from the listeners all the time is, why does it take 10 to 12 years to bring a drug to market? And why is it so hard? And they're right to ask, because from the outside, it feels like a black box. But inside the industry, we know drug discovery is closer to detective work than it is to engineering. There's hypothesis, dead ends, unexpected clues, constant iteration. Ivan, can you take us behind the curtain? How does an idea become a therapy?
Yeah, we need to give credit to the non-clinicians here, because that drug development process, perhaps for the public, starts when a given molecule or a drug, or to become a drug, starts clinical testing. And when I say clinical testing, the clinical trials. Somebody goes to the hospital and receives a promising potential new drug that may or may not help with their disease. There is at least 5 or 6 years of preclinical, in other words, non-human experimentation or discovery that goes from chemistry work, preclinical testing, all what the biologists and chemists do. And that needs to be very rigorous, very judicious. And that requires oftentimes around 4 to 5 years until that very abstract molecule is ready to enter the clinical testing.
Right.
So in those 10 years, around 5, I'm just giving a round number so that people think, have been invested already in a very rigorous and scientifically driven drug discovery, from that chemical entity to what is a drug. And that drug, what is ultimately, could be a pill, it could be a tablet, it could be in a liquid form for intravenous infusion. That also requires quite a lot of non-clinical expertise and processes. Okay, you've got 5 years behind you. Assume all that is successful, which is the other piece of what we were talking, or we will talk. We need to assume that all that preclinical experimentation has been flawlessly executed. We haven't found any issues in preclinical efficacy, etc. Then it starts the clinical testing. And then, of course, that takes also time, because we traditionally divide that clinical testing in 3 phases. The first one is to ensure that that promising molecule is safe. And what does the molecule does to our body, and how our body reacts to the molecule. That's what we call phase 1 trials or phase 1 studies. That may take another couple of years. We're counting 7 on average. Then you need to ensure, okay, in those patients where at least the drug was safe, tolerable, and did what it was meant to do, let's see if we can see some efficacy, of course, because that's the ultimate goal, to beat what is available in the marketplace, in the pharmacy, for your breast cancer, for your pancreatic cancer, for whatever the disease might be, not just even oncology. So you need to do that phase 2 of the clinical testing, another 2 years. We're counting 9. You were very optimistic, Kaushik, with 10. Perhaps it might be longer, or perhaps it might be shorter, but it's, I think, a good ballpark. But again, for illustration purposes to our audience, once you pass that phase 2, it starts the big moment where the stakes are the highest, to your point before, the phase 3. When you compare that very promising molecule that started perhaps 7 years ago in a lab with scientists, those what you see in the news doing very strange things with their hands, until it's reaching patients. And the phase 3 may still easily be another 3 to 4 years. So indeed, the entire journey of a molecule until it may become a drug could be as long as 10. What we're trying to do is to squeeze those timelines in many ways, using tools in the pre-discovery stage, and also trying to be more agile once the drug is reaching patients for clinical experimentation. So that's what is behind the scenes. It is a very scientifically rigorous process where there are many milestones or gates what you need to make tough decisions to say this drug may not hit the mark, hasn't shown enough efficacy. We cannot put this into patients because it won't have a transformational benefit. Or we think sometimes it's a very predictable exercise or unpredictable. You need to use tools to think, okay, shall we move forward or shall we stop, which is a tough decision, and invest this amount of financial money into something else.
Right. That's very well explained. I think we got a flavor of what goes on behind the curtains with drug discovery process and why it takes so long. So thank you for that. And my next question is around immuno-oncology. So when immuno-oncology burst onto the scene, it felt like something out of the science fiction, the idea that the body could be taught to fight cancer. And yet, despite the victories, we still don't fully understand why some patients respond dramatically while others don't respond at all. I think that paradox has become one of the defining puzzles in modern oncology. So, in simple terms, what makes immuno-oncology work and where are we still blind?
I would start by saying that this has been transformational over the last 5 to 10 years. As an oncologist, I've witnessed that success. It's been a bit of a, for those who, we need to give credit again to those who believed in immunology and its therapeutic applications to fight against cancer. I belong to the generation of physicians who studied immunology in his second year of medical school, and the science behind immunology is fascinating. How our body is in charge or defending against bacteria, viruses, or malignancies to some extent. And at that time, there were hypotheses by which one could think that at some point we could help or teach or modify the way our white blood cells, often known as B cells or T cells, lymphocytes, can fight against cancer. And I'm going back to 1995 when I was at medical school. We are, I think, 30 years later, and now we have seen one of the most efficacious tools in immuno-oncology, basically with something called PD-1 inhibitors, drugs now approved, such as pembrolizumab, nivolumab, and some others, which have transformed the outcomes of patients in many tumor types, to the point that some of them could be, and I'm always very careful with this word, could be considered almost cured or in prolonged remission. This was unthinkable at the time. Now we want to raise the bar even higher because, to your point, and that's true, despite those successes that are real and well documented that people do much better with immuno-oncology, still some tumors don't respond, or those tumors which respond end up becoming resistant to the therapy, which is not new, by the way, because again, we need to think that biology and our human body physiology is very complex. And by shutting down one pathway, another pathway reactivates. So thinking only simplistically that by blocking one of the tools our immune system has to recognize malignant cells, or actually sometimes they are blind to those malignant cells, and what these therapies do is make them aware that this cell doesn't belong to us and it's going to cause a harm. Therefore, please kill them. That's in essence what this story behind PD-1 inhibition does. It's allowing the T cells to take care of the cancer cells. But the cancer cells are very smart, unfortunately, and develop ways to circumvent the police being our white blood cells or T cells or B cells. So it's not just to predict which person will respond to the therapy, but also how that resistance develops. How should we combine these therapies? When should we switch into a different mechanism of action so that the cancer cell is a bit distracted? It's, oh, I didn't see this one coming. We should probably now develop resistance to that therapy. And then once they learn how to, because that's the truth, unfortunately, cancer cells are quite smart, or they adapt quickly. So we need to always be thinking ahead and say, okay, if that resistance happens, here is another way of circumventing that resistance until we are stronger than them, so to speak, and they are tired and they give up. But we cannot give up.
I really like the way you simplify these complex and abstract scientific phenomenons in a way that is accessible and can be understood by people without scientific background. So thank you so much for shedding light on that. And uh, I was once told that treating cancer with a single therapy is like trying to hack a multi-layered security system with one password. Because cancer adapts, it evolves. And that's why combination therapies are so exciting, but also so incredibly complex at the same time. The science is hard, but the safety decisions are even harder. So how do you think about designing combinations that are both effective and safe?
Yeah, safety here comes first.
Mm.
Of course, our goal is to get rid of the disease, but we need to make sure that, I'm back to the questions before about being grounded and how transitions are made from one job to the other. I always think and tell others, who is our end user? It is ourselves. It's a patient. And who is a patient? It's not they versus us. I could be a patient at some point. So we need to make sure that safety is paramount and the treatment we're giving is tolerable. That has also a caveat, because we have seen, if there are in the audience people who have been suffering or caregivers of people with, for example, acute leukemias or lymphomas, those tumors that are called liquid or blood cancers, those tumors have, or traditionally, higher cure rates than what we call solid tumors. Solid tumors meaning stomach cancer, pancreas cancer, lung, breast, etc. The therapies that we normally use to treat a lymphoma or a leukemia are way more aggressive, meaning that they can have very significant side effects. But the goal is so noble that we can potentially cure that patient, that the risk-benefit, which is a critical term, in this case, the benefit outweighs certain risks. So that benefit-risk statement needs to be floating around in our mind as drug developers all the time, and also for physicians. So yes, that's what I mean by safety comes first. But at the same time, you want to tilt the balance in a way that by using a combination therapy, you're going to increase your efficacy, you're going to raise the bar. And it needs to be a sensible approach, because just putting things together for the sake of adding another therapy may not work. And I'm going back and giving credit to my colleagues in preclinical research. They inform us about what makes sense. Does that make sense, for example, to combine a certain modality of immuno-oncology? Immuno-oncology, again, is modulating our immune system to help the system fight the disease.
Right.
With another therapy that targets directly the cancer cell. That makes sense. That it could be complementary, scientifically sounded, and then perhaps from a chemistry point of view, if you wish, okay, that also works. But then we need to make sure that when those two therapies are given together, there are no non-tolerable side effects that may put the patient at a higher risk. Again, always thinking about being more efficacious, more active, increasing remission rates, increasing survival, hopefully, potentially curing somebody. What better outcome than saying that someone you're cancer-free? Right. Dreaming with that as a physician, as an oncologist. But always making sure that we don't leave anybody behind, because also sometimes, and that is what creates a bit of a bad press on occasions, unless you are very well informed, some people, unfortunately, not just in oncology, with all diseases, can have a very impactful negative effect due to a therapy. So we need to minimize that percentage of people and benefit them the most with higher efficacious treatments.
Right. And when you zoom out, we are slowly moving from one-size-fits-all medicine to something much more personalized. And biomarkers are becoming the compass. They are the clues that tell us where to go, who might benefit, who might not, and who needs something different. But most listeners still don't fully understand what biomarkers actually is. So how do you explain biomarker to someone outside the field, and why do they matter so much?
They matter a lot. A biomarker, it is a trait or a characteristic of a cancer cell, or of our body, that informs us before giving therapy that therapy is going to work. It sounds like magic, but it happens. That requires, back again, a very rigorous basic research investigation to understand the biology of the disease. Let's take again the lung cancer example, which has been revolutionized by what we call targeted therapies. And we call them targeted therapies precisely based on that biomarker concept that you were alluding to. It all starts by understanding, okay, is there a driver? Is this cancer addicted, quote unquote, to a given pathway so that it grows and grows without control? And therefore, if we were to shut that pathway, the cancer would stop growing for a fair amount of time until, as I said before, develops perhaps resistance. And then that characteristic, that, I don't know, antenna, imagine a cancer cell has receptors. Receptors are antennas that can be seen from above. And once we identify those and say, actually, this tumor type has so many antennas of this type, and then our scientists in the lab have been able to create something that blocks, inhibits that antenna. And the antenna is what allows the cancer to grow. And since we're blocking that antenna with something externally, it happens. So that is a biomarker-driven treatment. We were able to say when the patient comes in, okay, the tumor, say, for example, was operated on, resected, and we take the tumor to the lab. Our colleagues in the lab, in the pathology, will tell us, listen, this tumor type is one of those that has this key characteristic, and we think this tumor is addicted to it. That is the biomarker. And then that information is served to the treating physician, to the oncologist, to say, I've got something available for you. I'm going to give this treatment instead of these 5 other options that are for what we say an all-comer population. We know your question before, immuno-oncology works saying in lung cancer again, in around 50%, 55, 45% of people. But what would be ideal is to know beforehand that you know you're going to be successful before even thinking that there are 5 options. That is the biomarker. And that is why we in oncology are trying to move towards predicting before the patient comes in, you know what is going to work. And again, give not for the sake of giving hope, but this is another field that has made substantial progress. There's still a long way to go, but if we were go back to the 80s, and I know people perhaps in the 80s are way younger than that, but 40 years in oncology is a fair amount of time to take perspective. 40 years ago, there were no biomarkers at all, none. 0. It was chemotherapy, which is toxic chemistry towards cancer cells and towards healthy cells. That's why people were having side effects. Now, still chemotherapy plays a critical role for the treatment of cancer, but there are many other engineered therapies that listen and learn from our scientists telling us, hey, listen, this tumor type has this characteristic, treat it with this drug. And we need to keep doing progress in that field.
I think we often forget that behind every single data point is a patient, is a human being, as you rightly said, and someone who says yes to something experimental because they believed it might help them or help someone else after them. And that makes trial design not just scientific act, but an ethical one. So how do you balance scientific rigor with the human reality of trial participation?
It goes back to the question of not losing your North Star. Why we're doing clinical trials? We're doing clinical trials for us, for patients, for ourselves when we become patients at some point. And those need to be patient-centric in a way. And what do I mean by this is that back to the, I've repeated this word quite a few times, rigorous. We need to be very scientifically driven, very purposeful, acknowledging that oftentimes, unfortunately, despite our best efforts and intentions, molecules are not as effective as we thought they would be in human beings, in patients. We need to make sure that what we bring, what we offer to that patient who is desperate, who is lacking options because her disease or his disease is progressing, that drug that you're going to give them on that clinical trial has the highest probability of success. And you may ask, Ivana, how can you assess that? Well, again, we have evolved and are learning. In the past, that phase 1, which is the first stage of clinical testing that I was making reference before, the phase 1 studies were meant to be for all sorts of patients with a variety of tumor types, most of them without any further options of treatment. And therefore, the chances of responding to a new promising drug were relatively low because the heterogeneity of those patients is broad.
Right.
Now, the phase 1 studies, again, this first clinical testing of a new drug has become much more targeted. And I think that is patient centricity, because instead of putting everyone or giving a false hope, and it's not a false hope because we're the first one asking for a miracle, but now we're trying to match that discovery to the patient that might benefit the most. So that is one patient-centric approach. The second one that I'm very passionate about, based on clinical experience as a physician and also as a caregiver to some extent, is that sometimes our pursuit of science makes us a bit blind about what is happening at the other side. If we were to take clinical protocols, and clinical protocols is the way we conduct a study, or the rules to conduct a study, what is needed from patients. We need them to come to the hospital more than what is the standard. So if someone is receiving treatment as a breast cancer patient, she knows that she needs to come on a weekly basis, on a bi-weekly basis, once a month. She receives her treatment 1 hour in the day clinic, and she goes back home. However, if this very patient participates in a complex, because clinical trials are complex clinical trials, she will deviate from her routine. She may need to come 3 times a week. Instead of being exposed to a one single blood draw before she receives chemotherapy, she will be asked to give blood 3 times every day, 3 times a week, because we are trying to study the way the drug behaves in her body. That's what we call pharmacokinetics. But that is not a standard. Or we may ask for additional urine analysis, or we may be asking to, please, can you fill in this questionnaire because we want to understand your quality of life. Again, great intentions behind, but the burden of procedures that we're putting on patients and the healthcare system is not negligible. So we need to balance when we do studies in what we want to learn from the clinical study, but also what can be absorbed by patients and caregivers. Not everyone lives 10 minutes from the hospital. Some people are elderly without not that much support. They also deserve to be on clinical trials. So we need to also adapt as much as we can, depending on the phase of the study, what we're asking for those patients. And the last thing that is also patient centricity, and try to scrutinize every single thing that we ask. We need to try and learn something from it, let alone study and analyze it. Because back again to the clinical trial procedures, they're becoming so complex that I don't want to lose sight of who is behind. And behind is a patient, a family, a caregiver, a routine that gets completely disrupted. And don't get me wrong, if the study is successful and the patient benefits, he or she will probably forget almost about all the sacrifices that he or she made. But if it doesn't work, it's like, wow, after all that I've done, after all the time, burden, days of being tired, this drug didn't work. So we need always to keep that in mind, to be very patient-centric.
Right. And have you heard of any such instances when after a rigorous clinical trial, somehow it didn't go in the direction we were hoping, and the patients were totally dissatisfied and came back and raised any concerns or complaints?
Yeah, I have to say that in my experience, cancer patients are the best human beings as patients. And of course, I don't want to categorize. If someone is listening and has Parkinson's disease, they will say, what about us?
Yeah.
In my experience, the gratitude that someone suffering with cancer has towards us, the physicians and the nurses and the people in hospital, it is something sort of extraordinary. In my career, I need to think through very hard to think of somebody who came back blaming or complaining that this didn't work. Of course, I think it comes also from how you inform and how you set expectations. So that is also a responsibility on us. Perhaps, of course, I may have had, or I'm sure I had experiences with someone told me, Ivan, Dr. Padilla, what you told me is not what has happened. And perhaps it was the truth. I was overly optimistic and I should have been more measured, more cautious. That is a lesson learned. Because there is nothing worse than receiving such negative feedback when your intentions were good.
Yeah.
So that is not to blame the patients, it's to blame us, those who look after them. We need to be at our best at all times, and also includes communication, setting expectations, explaining, be didactic, educational, because the science is complex. We need to explain that to lay people as well. And there is an emotional component, and we cannot forget about that either, because you may still explain this with your best words being measured, and the way the receiver takes it could be completely different. I hope I answered your question, but to me, I don't know if also is, as I said before, the way we learn about our failures. So I recall very vividly now in industry, a study that had a beautiful science, but it didn't work. And again, that takes time to process that. It's like, well, those people, particularly when you've been in clinical practice before, because you remember what it takes to be part of a clinical trial. But then, luckily enough, the company for which I was working at the time learned from that scientific failure, and the subsequent phase 3 clinical trial was positive and led to an approval of a drug that before, in a different setting, in different circumstances, didn't work. To me, that is one of the best examples that still you can learn from failures and benefit patients.
Thank you for explaining that. And I think one of the wildest truths about drug development is that progress often hides inside failures. A failed drug sometimes teaches us more than a successful one ever could. And the people who know how to read those signals, they are the ones who move the field forward. So, Ivan, can you share a moment where a setback ended up becoming a breakthrough inside?
Yeah, precisely the one that we were talking about. I don't know if a breakthrough, because that is a very subjective qualifier. To me, the fact that a drug ends up being approved and people can benefit from it is in itself a breakthrough. But what really is transformational is, in my opinion, what we've seen recently in recent years with Immunooncology. That is definitely a breakthrough. Or, for example, in my opinion, PARP inhibitors that has changed the way many women with a certain type of ovarian cancer have been treated and led to prolonged remissions. To me, it's not that much about that failure or that led to a success, which I gave an example before, but more so, back to the immuno-oncology theme that we have discussed today, is that sense of, I don't think this is never going to happen. This is too complex. The science is beautiful, and there is always a but. I'm not sure. To me, that resilience in that scientific judgment is what can become transformational.
Right.
Again, we're talking about 94, 95, perhaps even before. Some people in the audience may have heard about luminaries such as Jim Allison, Carl June. Those people now are making the headlines. But at the time, probably people thought they were like crazy scientists who thought that cancer could be cured with the immune system, and they were perhaps even disregarding them. See where they are, close to Nobel Prize, some of them actually recipients of those. So that is, to me, perhaps the most important lesson. If there is a good foundation and a good ground, keep pushing. There is a more recent example. I'm thinking about other complex pathway, and I don't want to go into deep science because I'm aware that the audience might not be scientists, all of them. KRAS. KRAS is an oncogene, a gene that drives malignant transformation. And for many, many years, we knew, or the scientists knew, that it was what we call a tumor driver. But there was no way of blocking its actions or developing drugs to block the way this very bad gene caused cancer. And it's been over the last 3 years that after persistent and resilient investigations, scientists and some pharmaceutical companies said, we want to really make sure that we have not left any stone unturned. And now we've got drugs targeting this famous KRAS pathway that have shown efficacy. Of course, they could be even more efficacious. We never give up. We never compromise in oncology, ourselves as oncologists and let alone patients. We will always do better. But to me, those two lessons, the immuno-oncology lesson on this more recent one, KRAS, are examples of good persistence when the science behind is strong enough. And if it's not that strong, go deeper until you finally make that transformational moment and say, yes, let's go for this drug and develop it.
And Ivan, we are living through a moment where AI is moving from buzzword to backbone in R&D. from molecule design to trial optimization. But AI isn't magic, as we all know. It's a tool, and like all tools, it only is as powerful as the question we ask. So, what excites you and what concerns you about AI's role in oncology?
Well, I have to raise my hand. I wish I was much more articulate or knowledgeable about AI. So please, I ask for apologies to you and the audience. What I would say, though, is that I'm still in the discovery mode about artificial intelligence. I think it probably has quite a few advantages or strengths in helping us with very tedious and mechanical processes when it comes to run clinical trials that can simplify and shorten the timelines that we spoke at the beginning of the interview when you were telling me, oh, it's about 10 years. Sometimes putting in place a clinical trial requires so much machinery and thinking and where to go because trials are done by hospitals, by doctors. And those doctors need to have the right patients to put the patients on the study. And we're talking about the world. And before it was, of course, based on experience and so forth, there are so many now analytical tools that tells you that map out, okay, where to go, predict how successful or how quickly you can fulfill or enroll, as we use the word, a clinical trial. And I've seen artificial intelligence telling us or helping us doing those sort of things. In a more less sophisticated manner, something that we haven't touched on today in our conversation is how complex also is the bureaucracy around clinical trials, the amount of documents, regulations, processes, the amount of paperwork that we need to put together, of course, don't get me wrong, to health authorities, to ethics committees, to there are so many elements in the chain. And sometimes the amount of time that we in the pharmaceutical industry spend writing, rewriting, putting documents together, I know this may sound trivial for artificial intelligence. People may have expected that Ivan tells us, no, artificial intelligence is going to help us discover better drugs. Perhaps I will ask you to invite a scientist and tell you a much more better answer than I'm providing today. But also in those sometimes tedious bureaucratic tasks, artificial intelligence can do a better job, much faster and much simpler. And you may say, oh, how can that help in the drug development process? Well, if a tedious mechanical process can be shortened and become more efficient, it means that the scientist or myself or whomever is in charge of doing scientific job will have twofold more time to dedicate his time to think and read and discuss scientific topics, whereas artificial intelligence can help us get rid of that routine, boring mechanical work. This would be the second application. The third one, as I said, I cannot speak about it, but I wish you find somebody who illustrates me and us that it also has its applications in drug discovery, because I've heard that is the case. And if you want to cover the concern piece, I don't know in drug development if I'm that concerned. If anything, and I'm just doing wishful thinking or dreaming as a layperson in artificial intelligence, I admit, it is more on the clinical setting meaning the doctor-patient interaction. As someone who belongs to a generation of those who like to be in front of people, touch them, hug them, be at the bedside, sometimes thinking that artificial intelligence could, and I don't see how, change all that. And I know sometimes it facilitates diagnosis. Now, it's probably a different topic. We are now doing virtual consults. This would be, before COVID time, something not to think about. So I know technology is helping the whole healthcare chain. But to me, in something as personal as oncology, I would be a bit concerned, or I would have some fears that human interaction gets lost just for the sake of technology. And again, I apologize because I'm not an expert on AI, but just there are my core concerns or views about the topic.
I think you provided a very comprehensive view on this topic. So thank you for that. This was really helpful. And Ivan, something that weighs on me and on many people listening is that breakthroughs don't reach everyone equally. A therapy discovered in Boston might take years to reach someone in Brazil or India. And sometimes cost becomes a barrier bigger than biology. So what will it take to close the global gap in cancer access?
I admit that this is the most difficult question you're posing to me today. I wish I had indeed, it's close to my heart. I wish I had a good answer or tools to explain or to understand the why. And with risking a bit of unpopularity amongst peers, I would say that we, and I say we now, the pharmaceutical industry has a big role to play there to facilitate more. And I think many companies such as mine and many others are trying to look more for the underserved patient populations, but it's not just a one-player game. Governments and regulators also need to weigh in and help us. I don't know if when people talk about access, I think people talk about pricing. And there is always very dangerous connotations or political opinions around that. And I want to be very careful, again, as I did in your former question about AI, because that's not my expertise. But believe me, those of us who are in healthcare, whether it's in industry, to be frank, do care that the drug reaches everyone. This is probably more than a pharmaceutical problem, because you are raising actually an economical problem, because the richness, the wealth is unevenly distributed. And that applies to everything. It applies to healthcare, applies to drugs, applies to access to living space, to water, etc. Because it's not just Brazil, it's Africa, it's Southeast Asia. There are so many barriers that I wish we could overcome, but I think it probably requires a concerted effort, not just only from the pharmaceutical industry. And again, raise my hand, we have a role to play, but I think it's other stakeholders. We are part of those stakeholders. We need to sit together and do something more. Not just drugs need to be accessible to a few, but to many.
Ivan, I often think about where we will be 10 to 15 years from now. Will cancer become a chronic condition? Will we cure certain tumor types? Or will we simply get better at managing them? Whatever the answer is, people like you are shaping it. And when you look ahead, what gives you the most hope for the future of cancer care?
The present gives me hope, Kaushik. I think I can definitely answer the question now. Back to my first year in medical school, the first time I stepped into a hospital as a junior resident, when I finished the specialty, and now I've seen a transformational change in outcomes for many tumor types. People that would have never dreamed to be in what we call remission are now in remission. And it's not just a few months. Some people are years without cancer. We cure, and I can say that particularly many more cancers in early stages, not only because of surgery for sure and radiotherapy, two key important tools for cancer treatment, but also due to the fact that we are developing better drugs that prevent the cancer to come back. And those tumors that sometimes we don't speak about them because the bad reputation takes always when someone has this terrible war of metastasis and say, well, cancer cannot be cured. Listen, there are many cancers that thanks to early detection and good therapies when the cancer is in its initial stages of development, we can get rid of it. So indeed, we're increasing those rates of cure. But even more importantly, that those who have the bad luck of having their tumors coming back with that famous word of metastasis are now today, in 2025, having much better chances than they had 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I've seen that myself with real examples that if you were to invite someone of my generation or even a generation before or a generation after, they could probably tell you the same thing. I've seen the chemotherapy, I've seen targeted therapies, I've seen immuno-oncology, I've seen cell therapies. We're starting to see something very sophisticated such as radiopharmaceuticals. I won't get into that today. Some people are starting to think about cancer vaccines, new technologies. So if we were to fast forward 10 years, I think what I'm saying today still would be valid, but scaled up according to the time. If the progress of science is as fast as the progress we have seen over the last decade, I think we will be in a much better place. So those tumors, say for example, just to be even more precise, if we are saying that now 50% of those lung cancer patients do respond, perhaps in 10 years it will be 80% or 70%. I don't know. I don't want to make any promises. I don't have a crystal ball, but back again to what I was saying before, clearly, 10 years ago, people with very few options or no options have now plenty, good ones. So what prevents us thinking that that won't be another leap into 10 years ahead of us if the progress of science continues at this pace? By the way, let me just ask again for the importance of investing in thinking about science, because it has a direct repercussion on all of us. So yes, I'm optimistic for the future, and I think there is not wishful thinking. It's not based on giving hope for the sake of giving hope to our audience. I think the facts are in our favor. I think we can have a bright future in oncology ahead of us.
I really admire your optimism, and I think that's what we need as a society. More scientists like yourselves who can instill that sense of optimism in the wider population. I think we are going to see better times in the near future, and things are definitely going to get better. So thank you for that reassurance. And Ivan, people in your position make decisions that ripple out across lives of doctors, patients, and even families worldwide. And those decisions, the scientific, financial, or strategic, shape your legacy in a way few careers do. So, what do you hope your contribution to oncology will ultimately stand for?
Well, I'll be much more humble, Kaushik. I think I hope I will be remembered as a caring physician, as a caring oncologist who tried tirelessly to help that person in front of me and their caregivers. And I also apologize for my mistakes. Something what we need to stay grounded and learn from those. In pharmaceutical industry and in science and in general, I've learned through my career that, in particular in this field, nothing can be accomplished alone. And we said this at the beginning, not just about the people who surround you personally, your family, your mentors, your managers. There is always a bit of good luck, being at the right time, at the right place, surrounded by that brilliant mind who shows you a data point and you pick up on that data point that day because you woke up bright and full of energy. That otherwise, if you had woken up another day with less motivation, you would have never paid attention to. So it is not just, what I do leave behind, what I did discover, that is very pretentious. Of course, if only just the sense of being part of a group of physicians who looked after patients well and did a good job gives me peace. As a drug developer, and looking back, well, I've been part, and I said this again and again, I've been part of great teams, sometimes leading at the front, sometimes sitting in the back, sometimes helping from the side, to see drugs that have been used for patients, for breast cancer patients. Or also, I think I may have contributed to the progress of science in certain disciplines, sometimes making tough calls and saying, you know what, despite this beautiful science, doesn't seem that we're gaining traction by keep investing into this pathway. Let's look in a different way, or let's look for another alternative. That is also brings value, as I said before. But ultimately, as I become more experienced, which is another way of saying that I'm becoming older, I really want to be remembered by people, by someone who helped others become better, or better physicians, better drug developers, trying to pass my baton of learnings or advice or coaching or mentoring. And people smarter than I did even greater things. I think there is nothing better to leave a legacy of people who end up being even more brilliant minds, or if they were brilliant minds, they didn't have the tool to execute that excellence. And I think in drug development over the last 15 years that I've been in this field or so, in the drug industry, I mean, that's the legacy that I want to leave behind, because those people will be the ones that you'll be interviewing in 10 years, and they will tell you what I'm saying today, that, hey, Kaushik, the cancer field has evolved dramatically. That will be perhaps my desired humble legacy.
It's absolutely commendable and inspiring for all of us. And Ivan, that brings us to the end of our today's conversation. And sitting here today, I'm reminded of why I started this show in the first place, to slow down, to listen, and to try and make sense of the extraordinary ideas shaping our future. And you've done something rare today. You've taken something complex, something that usually lives behind the lab doors, research papers and specialist conference and made it human, understandable, and relatable, and above all, meaningful. And what you've shared isn't just science, it's a window into the future, and a future that most people don't even realize is being built in real time. And I think that's what I'll take away from this conversation. The progress doesn't happen in giant leaps. It happens in these moments of curiosity, experimentation, bold thinking, and willingness to ask, what if? So thank you so much, not just for your insights, but for your generosity, your honesty, your willingness to bring us behind the curtain. And to everyone listening, thank you for giving your time and your attention. If this episode sparked something in you, a question, a moment of wonder, or even healthy dose of skepticism, that's good. That's exactly what we hope for. Next time, stay curious, stay open, and keep asking the questions that move the world forward. And Ivan, once again, a huge thank you to you for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. The pleasure has been mine, and I hope people feel inspired or at least curious about this conversation. Thank you, Kaushik.
Thank you so much.